Before I jump into our discussion of family poetry, I'd like to offer some advice about reading poetry. A lot of times people approach poems as though they are word problems in a math class. When solving a word problem, you try to look at the words, translate them into some type of formula, fill in values for variables, solve for x, and so forth. And you're trying to come up with an answer. And the idea is that everybody is supposed to take that word problem and come up with the right answer. And a lot of times people approach poems that way. They think that they're supposed to solve the problem and they're supposed to find the right answer. What is the secret meaning of this poem? I need to figure it out. Now, it can be very frustrating when you feel that you're supposed to figure out something and find the right answer, and you're having trouble doing that. So, what I found, a lot of times people say they hate math, but what they actually hate is the way that math makes them feel about themselves. When they're having a hard time solving a math problem, they may end up feeling dumb. They may not think that they're very smart, and they feel bad about themselves, and they don't like the way they feel. And so they just declare that they hate math, and then they try to avoid math as much as possible. And I notice that a lot of that goes on with poems as well. People have a frustrating experience where they're trying to solve a poem and figure out what does it mean. And then they can't figure out what it means, and they feel kind of dumb or stupid. They feel like everybody else gets the poem except for them. And they don't like the way that makes them feel about themselves. And actually nobody likes that feeling, right? And so we declare, oh, I hate poetry, and then we try to avoid poetry as much as possible. And that's a shame because, almost every child when we're young, we all like poetry. We love nursery rhymes and jump rope songs and all kinds of forms of poems and music. And even as adults, when we listen to music, whether it's pop music or hip hop or R&B or country music or whatever it is, we often listen to music that has lyrics. And those lyrics are a form of poetry. We love music, we love lyrics, we love poetry. And a lot of times we don't even stop to think that music and lyrics are actually poems. We say we hate poetry, but then we love listening to music and we sing along with the words and so forth. And so we have to think of poetry in that sense, that poetry is supposed to be an enjoyable experience. You're not supposed to overthink and analyze every poem, at least not for the first time or even the first few times that you read a poem. So my advice to you is to kind of treat poems as though they're lyrics to songs, and that you are trying to, when you read a poem, just enjoy the sound. Read the poem out loud and listen to the sound of the words, the rhyming and the rhythm of the lines. Also, there are certain images. Just allow certain images to come to mind. What do you see, touch, taste, smell? Think about the mood or atmosphere of the poem. How does the poem make you feel? So when you're reading the poem the first few times, you're really responding more on the level of the heart than you are of the mind. You're feeling the poem and enjoying it. You're going through some type of experience through your imagination. And then after a few times of just letting that poem sink in deep down into your soul and into your heart, then you can go back and then analyze the poem in detail, break apart the lines, look for specific figures of speech such as metaphors or simile. Are there any symbolism going in? What is going on here? What is the theme of the poem? Is there some type of message? How do I interpret that? And then I try to always apply the poem to my own experience. How is this poem relevant? What in my own life can I see in this poem? Okay, so now you're not going to like every poem. Some poems, it's just like works of art. Some works of art you like, and some you find you don't care for, that you have no connection to. You don't like every song. Some songs connect with you and you like, and some you don't. And so you don't have to like every single poem. But if you find yourself saying, I hate all poems, I don't like poetry at all, then maybe my suspicion is that you're approaching poetry in the wrong way. All right. So hopefully over the course of this class, as we get more practice reading and interpreting poetry, you'll start to enjoy it more, and you'll give poetry some um, a second chance. If you've written off poetry in the past, maybe you can come back to poems and enjoy reading them. All right. So we're going to start our discussion of poetry with the theme of families and the way that how our identities are shaped by our family, who are our parents and our siblings and all aunts and uncles and either they're family members by blood or adopted family members, or we have a strong bond of love that connects us. Whoever we consider our family, they have a lot of influence on us and the type of people that we grow up to be as adults. And so trying to become your own person, an independent person with your own sense of identity, a lot of that requires us to go back and really think about our relationships with our own family members. And so we start with poems about fathers and the way fathers affect us. And the first poem is by Lucille Clifton, and it's called Forgiving My Father. So when we read the poem, maybe we should just start by just looking at the title and thinking about the title for a little bit, right? So if I think about forgiving my father, I'm trying to imagine what are some reasons that fathers might have to be forgiven? What did the father do wrong? Do we have a father who's absent? Maybe the father took off and left the family and abandoned the family, and you have an absent father. Or maybe the father has been too aggressive or abusive, too domineering, constantly controlling the family, or, to whatever extent. Has the father done something wrong, right? Uh, and so start to imagine, what is your relationship with your own father? Do you have an absent father, abusive father, a very supportive and caring father? Sometimes when we're young, we have a view of our fathers as heroes. We think they're perfect, and we put like Superman. And then we find out that these people are human beings like everybody else, and they have their own flaws. And we might go the opposite direction and think this father's the worst person. So either our father is the best person in the world, or he's the worst person in the world. And at some point, we just have to figure out that a father is a human being. He has faults, strong points, and weak points, and we have to reconcile with that. All right. So I might just start thinking about many ways that I could forgive my father, right? Or reasons that I would have to forgive my father. What wrongs have been committed by this person? All right. So then when I get to the poem itself, I want to just read the poem through again without overthinking it, overanalyzing it. And I know that can be difficult when taking a literature class because you have a limited amount of time and you need to kind of hurry up and get to the point as fast as possible. But poems should not be rushed, right? You should slow down and enjoy the process. So if I read the poem here, it says, "It is Friday. We have come to the paying of the bills. All week you have stood in my dreams like a ghost, asking for more time. But today is payday. Payday, old man. My mother's hand opens in her early grave, and I hold it out like a good daughter. There is no more time for you. There will never be time enough, Daddy. Daddy, old lecher, old liar. I wish you were rich so I could take it all and give the lady what she was due. But you were the son of a needy father, the father of a needy son. You gave her all you had, which was nothing. You have already given her all you had. You are the pocket that was going to open and come up empty any Friday. You were each other's bad bargain, not mine. Daddy, old pauper, old prisoner, old dead man, what am I doing here collecting? You lie side by side in debtors' boxes, and no accounting will open them up." All right. So I might just start to go back and think about this poem is to just take some inventory about what I noticed. For example, I noticed the poem is divided into groups of lines. These are called stanzas. So you see there's a stanza up the top, and then one in the middle, and then one at the bottom. There's 3 stanzas. I also noticed that there's no real capitalization. They don't, the letter I in the word I is not capitalized. The beginnings of sentences are not capitalized. I might think, okay, how does that affect the poem, right? So I might just look at the structure, the way that the poem is put together. I might also start thinking about certain images, like what kinds of things come to mind. So we have this idea at the beginning of it being Friday. And we think of Friday at the end of the week, it's usually payday. And so at payday, you're given the money that you are owed, that you deserve. You've earned some type of money. And when it comes to Friday, it's come time to get your pay. And the feeling that I get throughout this poem is that she's expecting something from her father. Her father has to kind of pay up, right? Her father has to pay up, and somehow when it comes to payday, the father has no money, nothing to give. So the idea here that comes across is a father who has really, he says, you have given everything that you have to your family, and that is nothing. A father who has nothing to give to their family, right? So what comes across is a very negative. So I might not overthink the poem. I might just get a sense of the feeling that somebody has had a very difficult time growing up with this person, that this father has not been a supportive person. A father sometimes is a provider and a protector. And I get the sense that the father has not provided for the child. And I see that then again, that there's a metaphor going through the whole poem, and payday becomes the metaphor. We're not talking about an actual payday. She's using that idea as a metaphor for wanting something from her father that he's not giving to her, right? Love and support, encouragement, whatever it is. Okay. So we have come to the paying of the bills. All week you have stood in my dreams like a ghost, asking for more time. All right. So when it comes to payday, you say, okay, dad, you owe me the money. And he's like, well, I don't have the money. I'll pay you next week. And then next week comes, okay, it's time to pay up. And so he's constantly asking for more time. I don't have the money right now. If you could just give me another week, give me another week, give me another week. And so she's kind of saying to the point here that I've delayed it as much as possible. It's time for you to pay up at this point. I can't put it off any longer. I've put it off long enough. And then this idea of you stood in my dreams like a ghost. So the feeling I get here is that maybe the father's not alive anymore, that he's dead, And then that's interesting because you think, well, how is a ghost, how is somebody who's no longer living, how are they going to pay up? How can somebody who's dead actually pay their debts? So here you come asking for more time, but today is payday. Payday, old man. And sometimes we use that term for your dad. Hey, my old man. It can be a positive term or a negative term, but here it kind of says, it kind of like you're an old man. We're way at the end of his life. My mother's hand opens in her early grave. So, okay, the mother seems like she's died fairly young here. So the idea that the mom opening her hand, maybe the mother is wanting something from the husband. And it says, and I hold it out like a good daughter. And like a good daughter, maybe the lowercase I, not capitalizing things. To me, it kind of makes her seem younger, like she's a little child who hasn't learned how to capitalize sentences yet or whatever. And but she says, I'm like a good daughter. My mother and I, we hold our hands open, waiting for you to give us something that we want or something that we need. And our hands remain open, and yet nothing happens. You never pay up. All right. So I might just read that first stanza, and I kind of get that sense that there's a paying of bills, that payday has come, and the father has been constantly delaying that and putting it off. And she says, look, we have been waiting with our hands open, and now it's time to pay up. All right. So I move on to the second stanza. There is no more time for you. There will never be time enough, Daddy. Daddy, old lecher, old liar. So he says, okay, look, there's no more time. You keep saying, well, do it later, I'll do it later, later, but there's no more time. And she comes out and calls him a lecher and a liar. Very negative terms. Also, we see that as a alliteration. It's a poetic term where you use a repetition of the first sounds of a word, like daddy, daddy, or lecher, liar. I wish you were rich. Okay, so obviously he's not rich. If you're rich, I could take all that money that you have and I could give it to my mother, your wife. I could give her all the money that she was due. But you're not rich, she says. You really have nothing to give. And I love that line. You gave her all you had, which was nothing. So again, when you're trying to ask somebody to pay up, it's hard to ask a person with no money to pay up. Person says, I can't pay you. I have nothing to give you. I have no money to pay you. And so whatever the daughter wants from her father, she realizes her father cannot give her. She wants something that he will never give to her. And so there's a great metaphor. Again, remember, a metaphor is a poetic comparison. It doesn't use like or as. If we use like or as, it would be, we call that a simile, right? Like at the top in the first stanza when it said like a ghost is a simile. But here in the last stanza, it says, you are the pocket that was going to open and come up empty. So just like when you ask somebody to pay and they open up their pockets and show you that there's no money inside, she says her father himself is the pocket. He is an empty pocket. So she's trying to reach into an empty pocket, and you're not going to get anything. You were each other's bad bargain, not mine. And I like that line too, because it shows that her mother and father, right, they chose each other. They chose to get married or to be together. But obviously she did not choose to be born, right? You don't choose your own biological parent. And so she did not choose her father. So it says, you were each other's bad bargain, not mine. Okay, now here's another use of alliteration. Remember, daddy, old lecher, liar, LL. Now she says, pauper and prisoner, see, PP. Daddy, old pauper, old prisoner, old dead man. All right, so now we get the sense that maybe we suspected it, but we now know that her mother and father are both dead. They're both gone, right? So that makes more sense now. When we go back and see that he's dead, we can go read the poem again and see that he's a ghost. She's speaking to somebody who's dead. Okay, she couldn't get her father to pay up anything when he was alive. How is he going to pay anything when he's dead? And so that brings up the idea of how do we reconcile our problems and our conflicts that we've had with our parents if they're no longer with us. And so maybe that's why in line 21, she finally asked this question, what am I doing here collecting? I get the sense that she's almost like standing in the graveyard, looking down at the graves of her mother and her father. And all these thoughts are going through her head. And so when she says doing here, I almost think even in terms of an actual location of standing in the graveyard, standing at the gravesite of her mother and father, looking down at the tombstone or whatever, right? And saying, what am I doing here collecting? You lie side by side in debtors' boxes. In debtors' boxes, maybe people that are too poor to afford a certain type of burial, they're just put in debtors' boxes, a couple pine boxes, and thrown in the ground because they don't have enough money, right? So she says, you are lying here in debtors' boxes, and no accounting will open them up. And the idea, another kind of financial term here, this imagery of accounting, balancing the books, paying off your bills, settling your debts. And so she realizes that she's trying to, I guess, maybe heal from the past and move on to the future. Look, my father is not going to give me anything. He's gone. He's dead. He's just a memory, a ghost in my mind. And I need to kind of forgive my father. for my own sake, heal from any wounds that I am experiencing from the past, and move on and have a healthy future. So this idea of trying to reconcile, to forgive this father and move on, that's a idea that we're going to see in another poem later, the poem called Daddy by Sylvia Plath. All right. All right. So that's forgiving my father. Now let's move on to another one. I love this poem. This is one of my favorite poems. It's called Those Winter Sundays. And you can read some of the bio. Sometimes that helps you to kind of make sense of the poem, that we see that the poet here, Robert Hayden, is African American, right? We see that he grew up in a poor neighborhood. His natural parents left him with family friends. All right. So you might think about, not every poem, we don't always assume that the speaker, the persona, or the narrator, whatever this voice is, that's whoever's speaking to us in the poem, is not automatically the same as the poet. We can suspect there's something biographical, that the poet is sharing something about themselves, but we can't take every event in a poem or every statement literally. We cannot say this is exactly what happened to the poet. But we get a sense that this is a very personal poem to Robert Hayden. And so again, we can just read the poem all the way through out loud first without really trying to overthink it. And what sounds, what images, what feelings and ideas, whatever, what just comes to mind as you read the poem. Don't try to make too much sense of it. Just get all the ideas, so to speak, out onto the paper, and then come back and take another look at it. Okay. So Sundays too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor and the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? So when I think about that poem, I think, okay, it's a Sunday morning. Usually Sunday morning, people usually work Monday through Friday or Monday through Saturday, and Sunday seems to be a day off. So when he says Sundays too, my father got up early, which means we get the sense that, of course, he always gets up early to go to work. But even on his day off, the father gets up early. So we think about that as um, this is before anybody else in the family has gotten up. The father is the first one awake. And notice the kind of negative imagery, that it's blue, black, cold. It's like maybe a brutally cold day. So he has to get up in the cold, and he's using his cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather. So maybe all day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, maybe even Saturday, 5 6 days a week, he gets out there and he works in, let's say, terrible cold weather. His hands are cracked and aching from labor. So here is again, probably poor, hardworking person, gets up and goes to work all the time. And then even on his day off, he gets up early in the cold so that he can start the fire and warm the house up. And then it says at the end of the first stanza, line 5, no one ever thanked him. So it's like a thankless job. Here he is going through all this work, doing everything. Why is he working so hard? Why is he doing all this work to warm the house? And that becomes like a metaphor. His work to warm the house is sort of like taking care of people and helping them. Then he says, now here I come along, the kid, and I'd wake up and I'd hear the cold splintering and breaking. And when the rooms were warm, he'd call and I would slowly rise and dress. Okay. So then you say, okay, it's time to get up, and now the kid gets to wake up with the house already warm. But then he said, I would dress, but I would fearing the chronic angers of the house. So that's an interesting expression, chronic angers, right? Here you see that the chronic means that it's ongoing, that happens over and over and over again. It's an ongoing anger. And so maybe the dad is kind of angry, not easy to talk to. He's not maybe all warm and fuzzy. He doesn't say, oh, I love you or something. And you wonder, no, why is everybody so angry? Well, think about the father's life, constantly working so hard, getting up early in the morning, doing all that stuff to take care of the family, never getting any recognition, nobody ever thanking him. This kind of stuff might wear on somebody and make him angry. So maybe the father's angry and the son doesn't quite know how to deal with his father. He kind of maybe has a little bit of fear of his father, or he doesn't feel a close connection to his dad. So then, because of that, he says that he speaks indifferently to him who had driven out the cold. So the young child is speaking without any sense of affection or love. When you're indifferent, you don't really care, you show no emotion, right? And so the young kid is saying, well, I didn't even show any affection or emotion to him. I spoke very indifferently to him, even though he's the one who got up and worked so hard to drive out the cold out of my life, and even polished my shoes, right? And so now we get the sense this is an adult looking back on his childhood. Maybe his dad is already gone as well, just like in Forgiving My Father. Maybe the dad has died, and the son is going back through a memory and realizing that all that stuff that his dad did, that was a form of love. Maybe he didn't come right out and say it with words, but going through all that sacrifice and all that work without ever being thanked is an act of love. And so he says, well, what did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? When you love people, right? Austere and lonely. He's not getting any love back. He's giving, but he's not getting. But when you love people, it's not about getting. You give and give to them because you love them without expecting something in return. But of course, it would be nice to have something in return. So this gives us a chance to think about our relationships with our own parents. Doesn't have to be a father, but think about our guardians and parents, the people that have taken care of us. And maybe we've had all kinds of problems. We've had fights with them, or we told them that to get lost, and we took off and left the family, or we haven't spoken to a family member or a parent in years. Sometimes we go back over and we relive those moments, and we think through them and think, you know what, maybe this father was not perfect. He wasn't always giving hugs and saying I love you and all this stuff. But now that I think about it, he did everything he could. That was his way of showing us that he loved us. He could have easily just taken off and abandoned us. He didn't have to get up and go to work. He didn't have to put the fire on and polish his shoes, but he did. And so it's kind of sinking in slowly to the speaker of the poem here, that his father did love him, and he's going through this moment of reconciling with his father. Right. So I really love that poem. It's such a short poem, but so much is said. That's what makes poetry so great, is that so much can be said in a few amount of words or lines. And also, because of the poetry, the way it's written, is again, there's no just right or wrong answer to how we interpret it. Now, there are good and bad answers. We do want to, when we think something, we need to go to the text of the poem and support our ideas by what we see in the poem. But we can all interpret it differently. We all have different backgrounds and experiences. Your experience with your own parents and guardians and the people that have raised you will be different than the experiences that I've gone through. So I might come at this poem from a different perspective or angle than you did. And again, and also think about those lenses, those windows that we talked about these critical approaches. What does it mean to be a man? Okay, we've got two poems so far about a man. One father had given everything that he could, worked so hard for his family, and he never got thanked. And so we have two poems now where people are trying to think about their fathers. And now we move on to a third father poem, My Papa's Waltz. And this is a very interesting poem. It says, the whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. We romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt, then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. Now, what I notice here is you have this 1, 2, 3, 4 stanzas. And what I also know is that unlike the other kinds of the other poems here, we have a very distinct rhyming scheme, rhyming pattern. For example, the first line is breath, and the third line is death. The second line is dizzy, the third line is easy, which is close to a rhyme. So we have A, B, A, B. A is breath and death, and B is dizzy, easy. Then we have pans. It says shelf and itself. Pans and countenance. So they're kind of a slant rhyme, or very near, it's close to a rhyme, but it doesn't rhyme perfectly. But we do have shelf and itself. We have knuckle and buckle, right? Itself, shelf, head, bed, dirt, shirt. And we also have a very distinct rhythm. Not only do we have rhyme, we have a rhythm. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. We romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt, then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. See, so it's got a very, almost like a nursery rhyme, a kind of a childlike uh, pattern, rhythm. And we have this kind of iambic meter. Da, 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 da. Unstressed, stressed syllables. We romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. And so, again, how does it all affect the poem? Well, what I think is that it kind of makes it sound, again, like a child's poem, like a nursery rhyme, with the rhyme scheme, the ending words rhyming, and having a very distinct song-like, almost like a trotting of a horse, a very song-like rhythm. Again, it comes across sounding kind of like a childlike poem. And it says, the whiskey on your breath. So right away, I get the idea of a father who's been drinking. You could smell the whiskey on his breath. So maybe the father's a little bit drunk. So the whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. So we've got this childlike rhythm and rhyme, like almost like a nursery rhyme for a child's poem. But yet the content says whiskey and death, and such waltzing was not easy. So what's great about this poem is that there's a juxtaposition between positive and negative imagery. I think of waltzing, dancing, a father and a son dancing around as something fun, a happy moment. But a lot of the language and images that come across are very negative. So I'm getting the sense, is the husband and the father, is he abusive? Is he beating on the child? Like Farrington from Counterparts? Is he beating on his kid here? Or maybe he's kind of in a good mood, dancing him around, but because he's drunk, he's being a little bit, not on purpose, but he's being a little bit too rough on his son, and the son's getting a little bit scared. Or maybe sometimes the father's in a good mood, sometimes he's not, and the kid can never tell when his dad's going to go off. So everybody's kind of walking on eggshells. Something starts off in a nice, fun moment, then turns ugly fast, or whatever. So I don't know what's going on, but that's what's so great about this poem, is that things are happening on different levels at the same time. So he says, I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. So my papa's waltz, what does that even mean now? This is, we romped. And Rompt has a very aggressive stomping around the room, even that's so hard that the pans are sliding from the shelf. So that's a little bit of aggressive dance for a father with his child, right? And then it says, my mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. So the mother, obviously, she's frowning. She's not happy. So obviously something's not quite right. Why would the mother be so unhappy just because her husband is dancing with the child? And it says, the hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. Now, why is the hand battered? Did the husband hit his wife? Did the father hit the child? Is the battered knuckle from hard work, like the father in Winter Sundays? Is he off working hard, and then after a hard day's work, he gets something to drink, and he comes home? Hey, maybe this father is Farrington, huh? He comes home, he's drunk, the son's there, the wife is there. And so what do we make of that battered knuckle? It could be from beating a kid. It could just be from hitting it accidentally. It could be from hard work. And it says, at every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. So again, the child's small, so his ear is at the level of the father's belt buckle. And when the dad's kind of messing around and not dancing right, every misstep, the child is sort of being injured. The ear is scraping against this buckle. And then it says, you beat time on my head. So again, beating me, beating time on my head. And then it goes, a palm caked hard by dirt. So it says his hand is caked hard by dirt. And so when I get that palm caked by dirt and the battered knuckle, again, I get a sense of a father who is working hard. He goes out and labors all day outside in the dirt, and then has a very difficult life. Maybe doesn't get a lot of love or appreciation. And so maybe turns to drink or whatever to kind of cope with it, and then has gotten a little aggressive. And now he's being abusive and kind of scaring the child and his wife. So he waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. So it's such an interesting poem. And as the first question in the thinking about the text says, is the narrator looking back with fondness or bitterness, or a combination of both? Maybe he loved his father, but his father had these moments where maybe he just got out of control a little bit. But we can make many different things out of this poem. It can work on different levels. There doesn't have to be an exact right answer to a poem. We're not solving this as a math problem. We're just experiencing the poem. We're enjoying it. And then we're trying to just maybe connect it to our own experiences and find some personal meaning from the poem. Okay. Now we have a totally different view of a father in this next poem. This Chinese poet is talking about a father who likes to read a lot, reads the Psalms. He's a religious person, reads the newspaper, reads the Bible. And then it says he's got this image of his father, but it says, my father in heaven. So again, we know this is another person thinking about a father who has died. And I would think that in all four of these poems so far, maybe it's somebody thinking about a father who's no longer alive. And he says his father stops to listen for a sound of the child in the yard. And if he finds out that the child is crying, he will stop what he's reading, and he will go off and he'll try to help the child and save the child from grief. And so we get a very, in a sense, positive image of the father here in the first stanza. He's somebody who is educated, who reads, studies the Bible, who cares about these children. So to me, it seems like a very positive image. And what we have here is interesting, is what happens when you have a father who is a great person, like a hero. Sometimes children have a hard time living in the shadow of a great person. You have a father who is great, successful, wealthy, has power or prestige, or is a good citizen, a good neighbor, a good family member, right? Has all kinds of positive qualities. Maybe he's artistic, a great artist or musician, or a sports hero, or a war hero, or president of the United States, or whatever. You have some type of father or parent who has done something great. And now you have a child who doesn't feel that they can measure up, that they are kind of in the shadow and they kind of feel bad about themselves. They compare themselves to their hero father. They have a hero worship of the father. Then they compare themselves to the father and they feel inadequate, right? So that's what I get on line 10 when it says, my shoulders ached from his gaze. My shoulders ached from his gaze. That my father says he made me recite a book a month, and I forget everything as soon as I read it. A remarkable disappointment to him. See that? So he feels himself as a remarkable disappointment. So he feels that I can never measure up. My father's trying to get me to read and to study and to do all these things like he did. And I can't, I'm not good at this. I'm not successful like he is. And I feel like a remarkable disappointment. So in the first half of this poem, we have a very positive image of a parent. And the child compares himself to his father and feels that he does not measure up. And in comparison, he feels like a great disappointment. But he says here in line 25, or 27 or so, I don't disparage scholars. My father was one, and I loved him. Okay, that gets more, our suspicions have been confirmed here that his father is in fact a scholar, and he does in fact love his father. But then the image of his father switches here at the end of the poem. He says, at the doorway I watched, and I suddenly knew he was like me. He was one of the powerless. And so he had put his father up on a pedestal as a hero, and he thought that he was way down at the bottom. But then he saw something about his own father. He saw that his father had problems. His problem was his father was powerless, just like he felt. And he realized that his father was like him. So he feels a connection that, hey, my father and I are more alike than I had thought. And he starts to feel a connection. So instead of his father being some hero, some superhero, his father becomes an ordinary man, just a person. And the son can look at the father and feel some connection and say, hey, we are both alike. I am like my father. I have a connection to that. And he says at the end, is it praise or lament hidden in the next moment? So is he praising his father? Is he sad about the passing of his father? What's going on here? And I think again, it's a person developing his identity as an independent person. He's thinking about the influence that his father's had on him. And it makes a lot of sense when I go back and read the opening to the poem that his father was a teacher of medicine and philosophy. But during a purge of ethnic Chinese, his father was imprisoned because of his Western interests. So that makes sense now at the end of the poem, is that he sees this great father, this teaching medicine and philosophy, this scholar of a father. But his father was imprisoned. And when his father is captured and thrown in prison and becomes powerless, then the son sees something in his father that he connects with. And so it's a very interesting poem. Another example of a poet trying to work through the poem itself, work through a relationship with his father. Okay. I really like that poem a lot also. Okay. All right. Now we have some poems about grandparents. I love the relationship between grandparents and their grandchildren. Your parents are always the enemy. The grandparents and their grandchildren have a common enemy, and that is the grandchild's parents, right? So the grandfather's son is the grandchild's father, and that person in the middle is the common enemy. So grandparents are often cheerleaders and supporters of their grandkids. They don't have to do all the disciplining and the lecturing and the teaching and doing the homework. The grandkids can just hang out with their grandparents, and they can make food and tell stories and go fishing and just hang out. And it can be a very special and important relationship. Um, so I love this idea in Legacies, where the grandmother says, I want you to learn how to make rolls. And she says this proudly. So grandma wants her grandchild to come in and they want to spend some time. She's going to teach her how to make some type of food. It's the idea the grandchild she wants to leave a legacy. She wants to pass on this technique to her granddaughter. But the granddaughter does not want to do it. And she has some very interesting reason for not wanting it. She said that would mean that when the old one died, she would be less dependent on her spirit. So she has a good reason for saying no. She doesn't kind of want to take on the legacy of her grandmother, because then she's thinking about the future when her grandmother is going to die and no longer be with her. And she doesn't want to lose her grandmother. She doesn't want to be independent of her grandmother's spirit. So she says no, right? Now, maybe the grandmother misunderstands her reason for saying no. Maybe the grandmother just thinks, oh, she's a child and she doesn't want to spend her time with her grandmother. So she says, Lord, these children, right? And so it says, neither of them said what they meant. And I guess nobody ever does. I really like that ending of that poem. So there's like a lack of communication. The people are, you never really know what's inside somebody's heart. You don't know what they're thinking. And so nobody ever really comes out and says exactly what they mean. And so there's a lot going on here about what the grandmother wants to leave a legacy with her granddaughter. And her granddaughter, loves her grandmother and wants her grandmother to make her rolls. She feels if she learns how to do it on her own, then that's going to be a separation from her grandmother. And then, so she says she does not want to be independent of her spirit. Okay. So nice little picture of a grandmother and a granddaughter and how important that relationship can be. Grandparents are getting closer to death. They're getting old and their own kids will not listen to them. So they move on to their grandkids and say, I have all this wisdom. I have all these experiences. I want to pass on a legacy to you. Right. So we can think about this. The poem lets us think about our own relationship with our grandparents and what do these people mean to us and how do they affect us? Now, in Linda Hogan's poem, Heritage, we have Native American heritage, Chickasaw heritage, but the woman has a mixed heritage. She's part of her heritage is Native American and part of her heritage is European or white, okay? So she says, and now I like each stanza, what has she gotten? What has she inherited? People might say, oh, you poor dear, you got your father's nose, I got my mother's eyes, my grandfather's ears, I got my aunt's taste in clothes, I got my grandmother's musical talent, I got my intelligence from my grandfather, whatever, people always talk about what do they inherit? What do they get from their family members? And it's another type of legacy here, right? Or heritage or legacy. So it says, from my mother, I got an antique mirror where I watch my face take on her lines. So she knows as she's growing older, she sees herself more like her father. I mean, her mother, right? From her father, I got the brown eyes from the father. From uncle, I got the whittled wood. He sang old chants to me. From my grandfather, I learned to fear silence, to kill a snake when you're begging for rain. And from grandma, she was a blue-eyed woman with brown skin. She used snuff like a tobacco, right? And since this tobacco was the brown stain that covered my white shirt, my whiteness a shame. It was the brown earth of Oklahoma stained with oil. That tobacco is the dark night that covers me. So she's thinking about all the experiences her family's gone through as maybe Native Americans and the idea of the experiences, all the troubles they've gone through, maybe as farmers or working with the land, all the legends, spiritual beliefs, cultural ideas, everything that goes into a family or a culture has been passed down through these people to the poet. And so that's what this poem is doing, right? She says, "From my family, I have learned the secrets of never having a home." So you might think that, think about the way that your culture, your family have shaped you. And you want to find a way to honor the past and honor your ancestry and heritage, but you also have to find a way to become your own person, your own unique individual with your own goals. You can't live in the past, but you do have to have a good relationship with it. All right. So that's some ideas to think about for that poem. Right. I love this poem by Gary Soto, Behind Grandma's House. It says, at 10, I wanted fame and wanted to prove I was tough, kicking over trash cans, hurled light bulbs like grenades, flicked rocks at cats, kicked fences. I shooed pigeons, broke a branch from a flowering peach, frightened ants with a stream of piss, said a bunch of cuss words, running around like 10 years old trying to be a badass. Until Grandma came into the alley, her apron flapping in a breeze, her hair mussed, and said, "Let me help you," and punched me between the eyes. So that's just a great little poem that Grandma says, "Hey, let me help you," and she knocks some sense into her grandkid here. Uh, he's trying to do all these things like kicking over stuff and being mean to animals and stuff, and he thinks he's all that. And Grandma comes in and puts him in his place. So it's again a really clever little poem here that says a lot in a very small amount of words or lines. Okay. Here, next, Alberto Rios, Mi Abuelo, right? Uh, I like this line here. It says that he said that the poet said that being bilingual is like going through life with a pair of binoculars. Having at least two words for everything opens one's eyes to the world. And notice he's got this idea of being on borders. So for he has a father who's from Mexico and a mother from England. And even his own writing, he blurred the line between poetry and prose. And so the idea of being on borders, having your foot on one side of the border and then the other foot on the other side, straddling two worlds at the same time, is a very common theme for Rios and other poets, right? Chicano literature is all about somehow being part of two cultures at the same time, and sometimes never really feeling like you're part of either one. All right. Well, these poems now start to get a little bit more abstract, a little bit more difficult to understand what's going on. The language is more figurative, more kind of symbolic in a sense. But so we've got an idea here, again, of a grandfather who's dead. He's buried in the ground, and yet somehow the grandfather still influences the family, still kind of speaks to them. So he's getting the idea of somebody who's dead still speaking to you. And so he sets up this image of there being like the grandfather's in the ground and there's a pipe going down into the grave, and you listen to the pipe to hear what the grandfather's saying. So where my grandfather is in the ground, where you can hear the future like an Indian with his ear at the track. So the old idea of like a Native American who kind of puts their ears down to the railroad tracks and can tell when the train is coming. He says there's a pipe that leads down to him so that sometimes he whispers. And so we can think of this as not a literal pipe going down to a grave, but the idea that the grandfather is constantly influencing his family. He still whispers to them. And he says that the grandfather here is the man who speaks through all the mouths in my house. It's a very interesting idea here, right? And then my grandfather, I had a good relationship with my grandfather. I loved him a lot. And he was always telling me stories. He'd always say, "Hey, did I ever tell you about the time that I met your grandmother?" And he would tell me that story like all the time, over and over again. But every time he would say, "Hey, did I ever tell you about the time that I met your grandmother?" I would always say, "No, I haven't heard that before." because I just loved, he'd get all excited and talk about his experience and falling in love and doing all that stuff. And he'd kind of go down memory lane. And I loved storytelling. In fact, I think that people that love history usually have family members that are good storytellers, and they tell about what was life like in the old country, what was life like when they were young, and that they bring that past to life. And those of us that have family members like this, like I did with my grandfather, we love to hear those stories of the past. We usually then develop a taste for history. We like reading about stories about the past. And so maybe think about, you have these storytellers in your family, people who kind of know all the people and know all the records about what happened to who, when, and where. They're kind of like the people you go to when you want to find out, hey, what happened to great aunt, whatever, what happened 50 years ago? You go to that person and they have the memories of that and they tell you these stories. And so he says, I know the ground green coffee beans as a child. I'm sorry, I know he ground green coffee beans as a child. And sometimes he will talk about his wife. And sometimes when he was deaf and a man cured him by mail and he heard groundhogs talking, or about how he walked with a cane. And, and it says, at best, he was a liar. Now, my grandfather was a storyteller, and a lot of times you might think he was really good at BS. He was just kind of like, there's a fine line between storytelling, exaggerating, straight out lying. And sometimes the lines blur about how much of the story is true and how much is exaggerated or straight out lying about it. So, and again, I get a sense of the grandfather talking about the past, passing on these stories, still speaking to the family. And then again, he says he's an ordinary man. I look down the pipe sometimes. So again, you don't have to know every single line, analyze everything, but just go through and just get a nice sense of, here's a person who still wants to go back. Don't forget your grandparents. They should still have some type of impact or influence on you. You should still, in a sense, listen to their whispers. Go look down the pipe sometimes. Right? Okay, so that's pretty much it for that. And there's one last poem, and it's really difficult to read because the poem is written in very figurative language. This poem is called Daddy, right? So I'm going to walk through the poem and kind of explain what's going on here, right? Sylvia Plath, her father, Otto, developed diabetes. And he thought he had lung cancer, and he kind of neglected the diabetes. And his foot started swelling all up and getting gangrene. He had to have his foot amputated, and eventually the diabetes was too advanced. And when the poet was only 8 years old, the father died. She says in the poem here that she was 10, but in real life, she was only 8 years old when her father died. And her father was sort of a scholar, professor. He studied biology. And she had a very strong, powerful kind of father figure who died when she was 8. And that's left this tremendous impact on the poet. And this poem, the poet is trying to it's like an exorcism, trying to get rid of a demon or get rid of a ghost. She's trying to get over the memory of her father. She's trying to move on with her life. And so she has to kind of take this imaginary father and kill him. In a sense, she's trying to kill the memory of it, right? Kill this memory off. She has to sort of exorcise, get rid of this demon so she can move on with her life. So there's a lot of metaphors, right? She calls them a black shoe in which she lived like a foot for 30 years, poor and white. So I've lived for 30 years, right, trapped inside this kind of memory. You've had this hold on my life. And it's a reference to like a nursery rhyme, the woman in the shoe, the old woman in the shoe. And she says, you're like a black shoe in which I've been kind of stuffed here for 30 years. So when she says in the next stanza, I have had to kill you, you died before I had time. So when you grow up with an actual father, then you eventually get to the point where you figure out that they're just a regular human being, and hopefully you come to some type of mutual understanding and forgiveness and respect with each other. But if your parent dies when they're young, they remain a ghost, and you never have a chance to develop a new relationship with that real person. So here she's saying, in a sense, that I've had to kill off your memory because you died so young. The next metaphor here, she calls him a big statue, marvel heavy, ghastly statue with one gray toe. And I think that idea of the one gray toe comes from when he had diabetes and his foot got so big and swollen it had to be amputated. And he says you have your head in the Atlantic Ocean. So you think of like a statue that's like a famous statue that's like in the ocean and has to be kind of pulled out and restored and put into some type of museum or something. So she says, I used to pray to recover you. So her father's dying of diabetes and lost to her when she was little, and she's praying to get him back. Right. Then we move on to the next part of the poem. We learn about this heritage. Her father, Otto Plath, was from a Polish town. He's German language, spoke German. And she says, because of all the wars and everything, the town has sort of been like destroyed and kind of wiped off the face of the earth, so to speak. And so she's like, I can never really find out your heritage. I'm trying to find my heritage, and I can't find out where it is that you actually came from. So she says, so I could never tell where you put your foot, your root. I could never talk to you. So since he's gone, she can't just go to her father and say, hey, where are you from? Who's my grandmother? So when you're trying to get into touch with like your ancestry, you do ancestry.com, or you check your DNA to find out your heritage. Something about finding out your heritage helps you form your identity. And she can't do that because her father has gone. All right. A next big metaphor is she starts to think of her father as sort of like the head of a Nazi in charge of a concentration camp. She says, I start to feel like I'm an inmate, a Jewish inmate in a concentration camp, and you're like the German Nazi official, and I have this kind of sense of fear of you. So she gets the sense of they're like an engine, a train taking the Jews into these death camps, Dachau, Auschwitz, Belsen, right? And she says, I have always been scared of you with your Luftwaffe and your neat mustache and your Aryan eye, bright blue, Panzerman. So she's using these German words, right? Panzer, the tanks and the Air Force, and the mustache and the Aryan, blue eyes and everything. And so she says she's like some type of Nazi officer, and she's afraid of him as though she's a Jewish person. Then another image here. You stand at the blackboard, Daddy, in the picture I have of you. So she has a photograph of him at the blackboard teaching as a professor. And he has a cleft in his chin instead of the foot. Now that's a reference to the devil, the idea that the devil has like a cleft in the feet, like a hoof, like the feet of a goat or something. And so she's saying, you have a cleft in your chin and not your foot, but you're no less a devil. No less a devil than the man who broke my pretty red heart in two. Now, what's going on here is when her father died, when she was only 8, right? Her sense is that as she got older, she's searching for some type of connection to her father. So then when Sylvia Plath met this man who is also a poet, and she got into a relationship with him, they got married, they had a couple of kids, and eventually that man went off and had an affair. And Sylvia Plath moved, I think, over to England or something with her kids. And within about 3 or 4 months, she had killed herself and committed suicide. So Sylvia Plath is famous as a poet who had ultimately committed suicide. And what's going on in this part of the poem is that she's saying that because I could not connect with you, my dad, because you're dead, I kind of tried to find a father figure in my husband. I kind of attached to this man who was like a substitute for you. And she says at 20, I tried to die. And what she means there is when she was 20 years old, she tried to commit suicide and get back to you. So in the sense that he's dead, so she tried to kill herself. And it says, but they pulled me out of the sack and they stuck me together with glue. And then I knew what to do. I made a model of you. So she tried to kill herself at 20, but they kind of brought her back to life and fixed her up. So she moved on and tried to find a model of her father, which was her new husband. See, so she said, I do, I do. I mean, she said, I got married. But then she says, so daddy, I'm finally through. And that becomes the point to think about at the end of the poem. What does it mean when she says, I'm through? I said, I do, I do. So daddy, I'm finally through. The black telephone's off at the root. The voices just can't worm through. So she kind of disconnect the telephone so that the voice, the messages cannot get through. They kind of think about that pipe in the ground with the grandfather, or listening, trying to listen to that. And so she's like, I'm disconnecting the telephone. I don't want the voices to come through. Then she says, I've killed one man, I've killed two. What does this mean now? Here's the final metaphor, is the metaphor of the vampire. The vampire who said he was you. That vampire who said he was you was her husband. And then he cheated on her and they got a divorce, or she broke up with him. So in that sense, when she severed her relationship with her husband, that was, in a sense, killing the first vampire. And now the second vampire is her father. And the idea of the vampire, she says, and drank my blood for a year, 7 years, if you want to know. So she says, I was with this husband for 7 years. He basically drank my blood, like basically took everything out of my life. And now I've kind of gotten rid of him. Now he's out of my life. But now she's got to kind of get rid of her father. And she says, there's a stake in your fat black heart. So thinking of him being a vampire, she has to drive a stake into the vampire's heart in order to kill it. And so she says, so she gets the idea of the villagers all coming around and driving a stake into the vampire's heart and killing it. And so she says, daddy, daddy, you bastard, I am through. That's like a famous poem, famous line from a poem. Daddy, daddy, you bastard, I'm through. That's from the poem Daddy by Sylvia Plath. But she didn't really think of him as a bastard. The only thing he did as a bastard, in a sense, was dying young and leaving her struggling with this pain. Maybe she keeps struggling and struggling with all this pain and can't get through it and wants to move beyond it. She wants to heal and move on, but she can't. And so maybe that's why she calls him. She uses a very affectionate name, Daddy, Daddy. It's an affectionate sounding term of love and endearment. But then she says, you're a bastard. So what does she mean when I'm through? She could say, I'm done with life. I give up. I'm going to quit. But maybe it's like the Forgiving My Father poem when she said, like, what am I doing trying to collect from a ghost? Maybe she says, I'm through, meaning I'm over you now. I'm done trying to find something from you that I'm never going to get. I'm not going to get something from you because you're no longer alive. I need to get over these memories of you. I need to get over this, and so I can heal and move on. So there's a lot of ways to interpret that expression, I'm through. What does she mean by that? And we know that eventually she did commit suicide. She did struggle with mental illness and suicidal thoughts, and she did go through a lot of treatment throughout her life, right? So again, this is another kind of like love-hate relationship. She has positive and negative feelings, and she's trying to work those feelings out in the poem. And so the language is a lot of metaphors. She's dealing on a very figurative and symbolic level. It's not literal. We're not supposed to take this language to be literal. So it can be a difficult poem to read, but the more you know about her life and her father and her husband and her suicide, and you can go through this poem, each time you read it, you see more and more, and it starts to make sense and to mean more. All right. So that's it for the family poetry. Later on, we're going to do 2 more groups of poetry. But for now, we're done with poetry. And now I'm going to move on in the next video to talk about family stories.